You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The sermon you're about to listen to comes from our Summer 2024 series, Apocalypse Now, Revelation's Call to be Faithful Witnesses. In this series, we're talking about what Revelation meant for its original audience and what it means for the church today. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for listening.
It's amazing to me the way our brains have the ability to be shown one image and yet see multiple things within that one image. I can remember being a kid and waiting each month to receive my copy of Highlights magazine. Anybody remember that one? Anyone get that one when you were a kid? Remember, this is back before regular people had things like email, right? And the fact that there was something that came in the mail that had my name on it, that was a big deal. Anyway, each month I'd get my copy of Highlights, and one of my favorite things to do in each volume was the hidden picture. Right? There was this big picture, page-sized picture that made sense, but within that image, there were certain items hidden, and your job was to find each of those objects. For instance, here's a picture. Can you see that one a little bit? There's a picture of kids going to space school. The pictures made sense loosely, right? They made sense in and of themselves. But in that picture, you have to find a slice of pie and a wedge of watermelon and a whole slew of other things. And I would just spend time, so much time, staring at those things, finding all the things, seeing if they'd stuck in anything else that wasn't in the list. It was so fun to me. But maybe you've seen some of those pictures that look like one thing, but could also look like another thing, right? Like the famous example is this picture that either looks like a young woman kind of looking away or an old woman looking kind of down and to the left, right? How many of you saw the young woman first? How many of you saw the old woman first? Yeah, there's some of each of us. How many of you didn't see either? And you're like, what is this a picture of, Scott? Yeah, see, it's all right. Or what about this picture? What do you see here? All right, so I hear both a rabbit and a duck, right? It's the same picture, but if you tilt it just a little bit. Go ahead, Tim. It looks like, go back. Yeah, so it looks like a rabbit or it looks like a duck, depending on how you say it. It's the same picture, but we can see multiple things in it. Last one, what is it? It's not a skull. It's a woman looking into a mirror, putting on her makeup. Can you see it? Can you see it? So whether you see the skull or you see the woman putting on makeup, I'm sure psychologists would say there's something that tells you about yourselves. Well, if you haven't seen it yet, as we've made our way through, so far, just the first half of Revelation, but if you haven't seen it yet, the signs that we see throughout the book of Revelation can function in much the same way as some of these pictures that we've looked at this morning. They appear to be one thing, but they could also be something else. They could mean one thing for the churches there in Asia Minor to whom John was writing, and another thing for the churches at the very end of times when Jesus comes back. And it could be another thing for the churches that exist at every point in between those two. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one thing is right and the others are wrong. Right? Part of the beauty of a book like Revelation is that it can all be true because God's word speaks to all times. But it doesn't always point to the same things. It always speaks about the same kinds of things, right? But the details of that picture that's being painted, it looks different in each age of the church. And so before we get to that passage that Will read for us this morning from Revelation 13, I want to spend a little bit of time in Revelation 12. And so we read in Revelation chapter 12 that a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. What is this talking about? All right? Is John saying that here, this is what immediately happens after the 7th trumpet is blown that we saw in chapter 11? Well, maybe, but probably not. But this is the next vision that John sees as Jesus is revealing all of these things to John through these visions. Remember, Revelation wasn't written to give us an exact timeline to follow as we look for what the end times might be. So most scholars see in this section, they see in this sign of the woman. And it's very much a sign, right? Revelation tells us that much. A sign appeared in heaven. But most scholars see this as an image of Mary or Israel or Eve. Right? There's much more agreement that the child born to the woman represents Jesus, the Messiah. So, if that child is Jesus, then it makes sense, right, for us to think about Mary. She makes the most biological sense. Right? She's the woman who physically gave birth to Jesus. But the way the woman's described, clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet and the crown of 12 stars around her head, very much points back to another biblical story, right? Remember that dream that Joseph had when he said, "Oh, I had a dream, and the sun and the moon and 12 stars bowed down before me." How to win friends and influence your family, right there. But if we take that into consideration, he was talking about his family, which is the family that became the people of Israel. And that would make that woman a sign of Israel, or specifically the faithful remnant of Israel, which also played a part in producing Jesus, the Messiah, right? But we're also told in Genesis 3 that the offspring of the woman, right? Remember in Genesis 3, it's right after the man and the woman had eaten the fruit, and God comes looking for them, and they hide themselves. And when they tell God what happened, he begins to bring those curses on them for their disobedience, right? But we're told in Genesis 3 that the offspring of the woman would live in enmity with the offspring of the serpent. But ultimately, the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, even as the serpent bit at his heel. And this is widely understood to be the first prophecy about the Messiah in the Old Testament, right? A prophecy which was to be fulfilled by the Messiah and was fulfilled in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, is the woman Eve or Mary or Israel? And I think the answer is yes, right? We can see the different parts of that picture and see different things in it. All 3 of those women feed into the richness of this sign that John is drawing our attention to. And he talks about this fiery red dragon, right? And the dragon's a little easier, mostly because because John tells us in verse 9 that the devil is that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. And the devil, along with those angels who rebelled with him, the third of the stars which were swept out of the sky, were hurled to earth at the conclusion of this great war between the angels. Y'all tracking with me? There's a lot going on here, right? And we read this stuff and we're like, what is John trying to tell us? So this war that's interpreted as pointing to what happened in the heavenly realm in Jesus' life and death and resurrection, the great pivot point in history. And the implication of this is that the trials and the tribulations that the church faces now on earth are because the dragon and his fallen angels are enraged, that they've been kicked out of heaven. They no longer have access to that heavenly throne room, and they're lashing out against God's people because of their defeat, because of their expulsion. You know, the word Satan, it means accuser. And we see, like, through the Old Testament, places like Job, it talks about Satan going to God one day and bringing accusation against Job. And that's what Satan did. But the death of Jesus changed all of that. Right? There's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. And so Satan was cast out of heaven. And so we've got the woman, the child, the dragon, the stars, and all of this going on sets the context for chapter 13 and what we see happening there. And chapter 13 tells us that under the watch of this dragon, there's a beast that comes up out of the sea. And for the Jewish Christians who are steeped in the Old Testament scriptures, their minds would have immediately gone to Daniel's vision of 4 beasts that came up out of the sea. Daniel 7 tells us all about those beasts. It talks about a lion with wings and a bear with ribs in his mouth and a leopard with wings and a 4th beast, which was terrifying and yet different from these other beasts. It was a beast that had 10 horns. Sound familiar? John's vision takes those 4 beasts of Daniel's vision and it combines them all together into one terrible beast that has the characteristics of all those other beasts, each of the 4 beasts. In Daniel 7, it tells us that one like the Son of Man came and defeated the beast and was enthroned and was given authority. And then Daniel's vision is explained in the rest of chapter 7. We're told that the beasts each represent a king or a kingdom, but ultimately the kingdom of God is going to prevail. And I think God wanted his people to have this prophetic vision in mind and is saying that in the end, when it all comes down to it, the beasts are all the same. Right? The empires of the world that strive for power and grasp for power, they all are the same and they all demand people's worship and allegiance. Right? That's what we see here, isn't it? Because of the power of the beast, it says he does all kinds of miraculous signs and does these things, and the people on earth worship the beast and the dragon. They worship the beast and the dragon. Everyone that is, except for those names that are written in the Lamb's book of life, those who were faithfully walking with God. But if we were to keep reading in chapter 13 here, in verse 11, there's another beast that comes, not from the sea, but this time from the earth. And this second beast, it had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. The second beast looked like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. You don't have to look too far, friends, to see leaders, sometimes pastors even, who look like the Lamb, at least on the outside, but they speak like dragons. That second beast performed miraculous signs and spoke all these deceptive words and led the people in worshiping the first beast. And we're told there at the end of chapter 13 that this second beast put a mark on the forehead and on the hands of the people. And they needed this mark to be able to participate in civil and economic life. This mark, we commonly call it what? The mark of the beast, right? Has caused so much ink to be spilled in the name of trying to figure out what exactly it means, exactly what it is or will be. But here's the thing, friends. If you've been tracking with me throughout this series, this may not surprise you, but I think there have been many marks of the beast, right? As many marks of the beast as there have been generations of the church. Because it's not about what will be that one mark that believers must avoid receiving at all costs. It's about the one thing that the powers of this world in any age demand, which would compromise our allegiance to Jesus. Right? And there are examples in every generation, beliefs and ideologies and practices that we're demanded to follow if we're going to be part of the world, but those things go against the way of the Lamb. And so for John's original audience, it was worship of the emperor and the pagan gods, right? You couldn't be part of a professional guild in a city like Ephesus without sacrificing or offering incense to Artemis. She was their god that they worshiped. They had this huge temple there in the midst of Ephesus. And this is exactly what we see at play if we were to turn over to Acts chapter 19. Right? When Paul is there and he's preaching, and Demetrius the silversmith stirred up the people against Paul and his message. And the people started this huge riot when they realized what was happening, and they chanted in unison for over 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Over and over and over again, the message that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the only God was a threat not only to their livelihoods, but to their very way of life. So the dragon, the beast, the mark of the beast, it's all about where you will give your allegiance. Are you willing to commit yourself to following the way of the Lamb no matter what it will cost you? Because there's always going to be a beast demanding our allegiance. Always an agenda and a mark that will be used to determine who is given worldly power and who is allowed a voice in the conversations that are happening. And so there will be a beast who is vying for power when Jesus comes again. But friends, Satan doesn't know any more than you and I do when Jesus is coming back again. But the way of the world has become the way of the dragon. And the dragon is always looking for our worship, always demanding our allegiance, always demanding that we acknowledge something that goes against the way of Jesus. But I'm convinced the more we focused on being marked by Christ, the more we focus on being marked by the way of the Lamb, the less we need to worry about somehow receiving this mark of the beast. if we'll focus on following Jesus, if we'll focus on living according to what he says and who he has called us to be, we don't need to worry. We don't need to worry. It might cost us something. It might cost us a job or influence. For some in our world, it costs even their lives. But if our eyes are fixed on Jesus, if our eyes are fastened on the Lamb who was slain, and we spend our time and our energy and our focus on trying to look like him, on trying to follow him, on the marks of him being marked in us, we don't have to worry. We don't have to worry that somehow we're going to say yes to the mark of the beast, because we're going to see. We're going to see it for what it is, because the way of the beast, the way of the dragon, it goes against the way of the Lamb at every point. And so this morning, we come to Christ's table together, not just to remember what Christ has done for us, but to celebrate that even though we still wait for Christ's return to set things right, and we wait for that decisive victory to happen, we understand, we celebrate that it's already been won in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we come to the table this morning to be marked by the way of the Lamb. As we take into our bodies, his body and his blood, we join ourselves together to Christ's victorious sacrifice, and we declare again that we are giving our allegiance to Jesus and to Jesus alone.